On the 11th of November 1918, in a siding in the Compiègne forest, Marshal Foch signed the armistice, and the horrors of the Great War were finally over. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but it didn't end up that way, and that was mainly due to what happened in the following year at the Treaty of Versailles. So, straight after the armistice was signed, the three leaders of the victorious powers began to kind of work out what they wanted from any peace agreement at the end of the war. The president of France was Georges Clemenceau, who sported the most fantastic facial hair, the likes of which you don't see in politics nowadays. And Georges Clemenceau was leading a French nation that was bruised and bitter and hurt after the horrors of the First World War. Most of the fighting had happened on French soil, and there had been a huge amount of destruction, and the French people wanted revenge on Germany. And they hadn't forgotten the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, when Germany had defeated France militarily and taken the land of Alsace-Lorraine from them. So Georges Clemenceau came to the peace talks wanting to ensure that Germany paid for what it has done. The leader of America, President of America, was a chap called Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was very much an idealist. And before the end of the war, he'd set out his 14 points for working out a peaceful solution. And one of the key ideas in these 14 points was to ensure that all diplomacy in the future is open and transparent, and that individual nationalities had their own country, what he called self-determination. So, for example, Hungarians should have their own country of Hungary. America had only joined the war in 1917, and the American mainland, of course, had not been affected at all by the conflict. So the American people were quite removed from putting any pressure on Woodrow Wilson during the negotiations. The Prime Minister of England was David Lloyd George. Now, the British people, having been fired up by 4 years of propaganda, were like the French people. They wanted to get revenge on the German people. They wanted to make them pay. However, Lloyd George and many people in Parliament realised that the best thing for the British Empire, the best thing for the British economy, was to work out a peace agreement which didn't punish Germany that badly, because Britain still wanted to trade with them. They still wanted relatively peace in the world, because that was good for trade and it was good for business. So David Lloyd George was walking a kind of tightrope. He wanted to ensure that the solution wasn't too harsh on Germany, while still making it quite harsh so that he could make sure that he showed the British voters what he was doing and meeting their needs. So the big three finally got together, and the place they decided to meet was dictated by Georges Clemenceau, and he suggested that they all meet up at the beautiful Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris. Now, the choosing of this location was no coincidence. In the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germanic state had defeated France in 1871, the Emperor Wilhelm I had crowned himself in the Palace of Versailles, and he did it on the 18th of January back in 1871. And Clemenceau suggested that they began the peace negotiations on the 18th of January in the Palace of Versailles, but this time in 1919. So it was very much a statement by Clemenceau that he remembered the pain that they had suffered, and he was setting out to get revenge. So the main location in the Palace of Versailles was the famous Hall of Mirrors, where the mirrors on the right-hand side reflected the sunlight coming in from the gardens on the left-hand side. And it's actually a beautiful room. And representatives from the major victorious powers all met to have negotiations about the best peace for the future of Europe. Now, they decided that the defeated nations, so Germany and their allies like Bulgaria, shouldn't be allowed to attend, nor of course should Russia, because they pulled out of the war in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. So some of the major powers in the world weren't invited along, which some consider might have been a bit of a mistake. And so the big three and some other nations and their diplomats thrashed out an agreement which they thought would bring a conclusion to the war and hopefully prevent wars happening in the future. So first of all, what they agreed to do with Germany. So you can see here the outline of the map, apart from the green bit at the bottom, is the outline of the great German nation as it was at the start of the war in 1914. And the big three decided to take about 10% of Germany's land away in quite a humiliating fashion. So in the north, they took away the area of Schleswig-Holstein and gave it back to Denmark. And the Germans and the Danes have been fighting over this piece of land for centuries, but this treaty gave that piece of land back to Denmark. In the west, they gave Alsace-Lorraine back to the French, which the Prussians had taken in 1871, and they also gave pieces of land back to Belgium. The Saarland, which was adjacent to Alsace-Lorraine, was also declared to be, even though it's owned by Germany, the profits from that area were to be paid back to France. The whole of the western area of Germany, the Rhineland, was, even though it's controlled by Germany, was declared a demilitarized zone, and Germany weren't allowed to put any soldiers in there at all. To the east of the country, whole swathes of eastern Germany were given to create the new nation of Poland, separating the far eastern part of Germany, Danzig, off from the main part of the country by what was known as the Polish Corridor. To the south, the Germanic-speaking peoples in Austria were forbidden from ever uniting with the rest of Germany in the future, what's known as the Anschluss, which should never be allowed. And living in the new country of Czechoslovakia, in an area called the Sudetenland, there are also lots of German-speaking peoples who weren't allowed to live in the borders of Germany. So as you can see, the territorial decisions made about Germany were really, really harsh and took lots of land away from Germany. But that's not all. The big three said to Germany, in a very controversial clause, Article 231, that Germany had to accept guilt for starting the war. They had to admit that the whole war was their fault. Now, I'm sure you know that the First World War didn't start in Germany. It started with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian terrorist in Sarajevo, which caused Austro-Hungarian Empire to declare war on Serbia. Then Russia got involved, and then Germany got involved. But that was all ignored, and Germany just had to accept that the war was their fault. It was also agreed that Germany was not allowed to have an air force or navy, that it was only allowed a tiniest of armies, which would just about manage to man the border posts around its country, so completely destroying its military might as well. And on top of that, because Germany had accepted responsibility for the war, they had to pay for the damage that had happened to countries like France, to pay for repairs, so what's known as reparations. And the figure was finally worked out at £6.6 billion that Germany had to pay back to the Allied countries. And it's such a huge figure, and Germany caused Germany such economic stress that they didn't pay it back for a full 90 years. In fact, their last payment wasn't made until October the 3rd, 2010. So The Treaty of Versailles was incredibly harsh on Germany, and as you can see, that Clemenceau effectively got what he wanted in designing a treaty that really would punish Germany. For the rest of Europe, we can see that maybe Wilson was more successful in getting what he wanted. So before the war in 1914, you had the German Empire, and in the middle of Europe you had this huge Austro-Hungarian Empire made up of lots of different nationalities. And the other agreements in the Paris Peace Treaty changed the map of Europe. So the Hungarian people were given the country of Hungary, the Austrian people were given the country of Austria, Romanians the country of Romania, the Poles the country of Poland, and Lithuania and Latvia were created. And also the Czechs and the Slovaks had to share a country, Czechoslovakia, which has since been split up into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. To the south, the Yugoslavia, which means the southern Slavs, the country was created, which was an amalgamation of several different national groups, which it was good to cause problems later on. In the 1980s, but we can see here that Woodrow Wilson's kind of idea of self-determination of individual races getting their own countries was put into place in Central Europe. Of course, this wasn't put into place in empires around the world. So India, which was part of the British Empire, the Indians didn't get independence at all. This was only referring to Europeans, of course. And so the German politicians that were left in power after the Kaiser had fled were invited to the Versailles Palace on the 28th of June, and they had no choice but to sign this. Germany had been torn apart by internal chaos. There were food shortages, starvation, the Spanish flu was killing tens of thousands of people. They were facing communist uprisings, riots on the streets, and the last thing that they could do at this stage was to put a military effort together to continue fighting the war. But it was, however, a real humiliation for them. Germany had not been defeated militarily in 1918. No Allied troops had invaded German soil, and yet still they had to sign a treaty which gave away 10% of their land, destroyed their military, set them up for debt for the next 90 years. But to many, they had no choice. And the reaction in Germany was not very favourable at all. And this is possibly one of my favourite cartoons, which captures what the German people felt about the Treaty of Versailles. You can see there the vampire with the moustache, giving away that this vampire is actually a caricature of the French president Georges Clemenceau, and he is sucking the beautiful German nation dry. The German nation there has voluntarily laid down their weapons, as you can see down by the side of the bed, but even though they've voluntarily surrendered, the French are still taking advantage of them and bleeding them dry. And if you see just outside the window, the open window that you can tell it's open by the curtains flapping, are the vampire bats of Britain and America, just swooping there, waiting their turn, waiting for France to finish bleeding Germany dry before they swoop in and take their share. So you really get a sense of the sense of injury that the German people felt because of the treaty that was forced upon them. But this cynicism about the treaty wasn't just felt in Germany. Here we have another cartoon, which is a very famous cartoon, Peace and Future Cannon Fodder. And there you can see Clemenceau and Wilson and Lloyd George in the back, and the Italian Vittorio Orlando, the Italian leader there, and the class of 1940 there crying in the corner. And the tiger, which was a nickname for Clemenceau, says, "Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." So, as you can see, people foretold that this treaty was not going to end all wars, that in the future, maybe by about 1940, there would be a future war because this treaty did not, in fact, bring a secure peace to Europe.